in Article 47 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights that guarantees that we have access to our courts, meaning that they have to be factually accessible, so also the costs should not be too high, and also the procedure should not be very complex and lengthy, because then you simply don't have proper access to enforcing your rights. So these are fundamental, and also were always in the back of our minds when we're drafting these rules of the ELI UNIDROIT project. Well, probably many of you know the saying, justice delayed is justice denied. In other words, if justice takes many, many, many years, then actually it's no longer justice. It's maybe a procedure, but it's not justice. Goldstein, well, it was attributed to him. But then another Israeli judge said, well, what is also important, and that's also important to me personally, professionally, delayed justice is sometimes, not always, preferable to swift, or, well, it is preferable to swift injustice. So there always has to be a balance, and that's also what we try to express in these rules: efficiency, speediness, and not too high cost and not too much complexity is very important. But of course, we have to respect the fundamental rights, the rights to be heard, etc., to also justify a good and reasonable outcome. So we have to work with this tension always. We've seen in recent years, and then these rules were imported. But we have continued first using the French rules, but then also looking on what happens in Germany, sometimes looking what happens in England. So also in the Netherlands, we have a more mixed system now, and we cannot say we belong to that family, that legal family, because it is a mixture. And even common law and civil law there's a certain amount of convergence between these two systems, because they both have good features. Let's say cross-fertilization. That is a nice and good word. Then also coming from my interest, globalization is very much attached to rules of private international law. And from my perspective, and I must admit I'm not sure how this is defined in Brazil, that is about the applicable law, rules for the applicable law, but also we count rules on international jurisdiction and recognition as part of private international law. It's the same as in your country. In most countries it is, but in some countries like Germany, they split conflict of laws and international litigation. And private international law is, of course, also a very fertile ground of enabling globalization and also to bridge differences, not by harmonizing the law itself, but at least ensuring that there is some kind of bridge to pass the gap between our systems, between the different applicable laws, and between also the different institutions and jurisdictions in the sense of which court can deal with the case. But those private international law rules are not always sufficient. And what we have seen in Europe is that first the private international law rules were harmonized, also following sometimes the example of the rules of the Hague Conference on Private International Law. So for instance, rules on service of documents and the taking of evidence are, well, rules of international litigation that we had at the global level, first from the Hague Conference, and then the EU, being a regional unit, took over those rules, improved them, advanced them, because that is possible within a regional unit. But it's not always enough, and we see that civil procedure creeps in, and especially in Europe, being this regional unit. Well, we were a unit. You know that we lost a part a few days ago, unfortunately. We hope to still be united in some way and continue and move on. Sometimes we have seen the shift from only private international law rules to more general rules of judicial cooperation, when you look at the whole spectrum of what we have in Europe now, it's not only those rules on international jurisdiction, applicable law, recognition and enforcement, but we also have established general rules of civil procedure, harmonizing certain aspects of the procedure, but also creating genuine procedures. The European Small Claims Procedure, for instance, and the European Order for Payment Procedure are two examples of that. So we have moved on. And why? Well, because those rules of private international law bridge the gap, but in practice, parties, and especially, for instance, consumers, smaller parties, still have a lot of issues if they have to litigate abroad. It's very nice if you know to which court to go. It's very nice if you can enforce your judgment in another country. But if the access to justice is still very complicated because our systems differ a lot, of course, we have language differences in Europe, many official languages, and all the procedures differ a lot, then it is still very difficult to have access, and those cross-border procedures are still very expensive. And that is why we have moved beyond only harmonizing private international law to also harmonizing parts, but only parts of civil procedure. And that's very challenging because, first of all, we need to reach a compromise, and until recently that also included the common law system of the UK. But also these have to be applied and implemented in the national context, because it is in the end the national courts that apply those rules. What we see in the harmonization in Europe, but also very much at the global level, is that procedural law is very much entwined and interconnected with the legal culture in a certain country, but also with substantive law. In Europe, we have a procedure that's the European Account Preservation Order, which is an attachment order, a seizure order, where you can attach a bank account of someone in a particular country, but then at the same time freeze the bank accounts of this person or this company in other countries to ensure that they don't transfer money and then the money is gone and you can no longer enforce it. The money is disappearing in another bank account. But also there, not only we notice that the legal cultures of the member state, how far can you go in attachment, what requirements and minimum standards do you have, etc., what kind of protection do you have, but also substantive law creeps in there. The law of obligations and property law come into the picture, and there you see that it becomes very difficult to harmonize civil procedure at the international and even at the European level. When you work with civil procedural law, and that is also the basis of our project, because we've worked with around 45 people in the different working groups coming from many different European countries. So what we were doing all the time is actually comparative law. How does it work in your system? Does it work well or not? And how can we come to hopefully a best rule in a particular area? And what is also difficult, a very long time ago, I did my PhD on the cross-border, again, between civil procedure and private international law, because it was about provisional measures in the international, private international law context. And if you would start only with the word provisional measure, and you would, for instance, start from a Dutch perspective on provisional measures, that would completely differ from what it is, for instance, in England or in Germany. And even now it differs with France, though our civil procedure comes from France. And then this word provisional measure, or in Dutch we have a certain procedure which was called kort geding, that would translate as summary proceeding, but summary procedure proceedings in England is completely different from our provisional procedure that has, well, literally the same or almost literally the same name. So what we always have to do in comparative civil procedure is take a functional approach. What does a certain procedural measure, mean in a procedural context. What is the function of this procedure? And then it might be that we think, hey, we don't have that at all. But if you look at the system as a whole, you might find that you do have it. What we also see, what I see coming from the Netherlands, is that sometimes our rules of civil procedure are misunderstood, which I perfectly understand, also because our rules are in Dutch and only in recent years they have become translated. There, if you look, for instance, at these provisional measure procedures that we have, then they often say, hey, but this is not really a provisional measure because you actually use it to solve the case until the end, etc. But if you understand how this rule functions within the system as a whole, and knowing that we lack other procedures that may fulfill the same function in other systems, then you get an understanding. Yeah? So, and what we have had in recent years is a lot of debate on collective redress, collective actions. But when you want to reach harmonization, you cannot only say, well, we pick that one or that one. You also have to look for a common core. Of course, for our model rules that we have been developing, there we could be a little bit more free, saying, well, not everyone has to agree, but if at least we agree to a certain extent that these are very good rules, then we can implement them. When you look at harmonization at the institutional level, the European Union, then this common core and this agreement and also compromise is extremely important. And that is very difficult sometimes. If we look at the global level, then what we have so far, well, in hard and fast rules, black letter law, we don't have a lot when it comes to civil procedure. What we do have is a model law, the ELI UNIDROIT principles of transnational civil procedure that have been established and formally adopted in 2004. And it was an initiative of the American Law Institute and UNIDROIT. What they also try to do there is cross the bridges between common law and civil law. They have collaborated very closely in order to pick the systems and the rules that had a common core, but that were at the same time considered as being best rules or best practices. That's nice, and academics have looked at it, but the influence, the practical influence has been very, very limited. And that is also why this project has been picked up to make a regional version and to advance these rules, to build on these rules and see if we can make a difference with that. When it comes to harmonization of black letter law, institutional harmonization, then the European Union has made a lot of progress, and I will go into that. If we look at the European Union Civil Justice Framework and the agenda, then 1999, now over 20 years ago, was a very important year, because in that year, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union created competence for judicial cooperation, both criminal judicial cooperation and civil judicial cooperation. The civil justice has gone further than the criminal justice, but also in criminal justice, for instance, we have the European arrest warrant, is a very important means for judicial cooperation within the EU. But of course, you understand, in civil law, it's a bit easier than it is in criminal law. What makes it difficult is that we have in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, Article 81 on this judicial cooperation that was established or became applicable in 1999. But that is only for cases having cross-border implications. And this cross-border implications always has been emphasized. The European Commission has tried a couple of times to make instruments such as the European Small Claims Procedure and Mediation Directive and try to extend the scope to domestic, national cases, but there was always resistance from the Council, which represents the member states. So most of the member states always said, no, if you look at the letter and also the spirit of Article 81 and also the principles of proportionality and subsidiarity, we can only make rules for those cases that have cross-border, international, European aspects. We don't want you to touch our domestic civil procedure. That's basically the message. But we do have some rules that also apply to domestic cases, but it has another basis in the treaty, and that is Article 114. On the basis of this provision, sectorial rules can be made. These are rules that apply to a certain substantive area of EU law, for instance, consumer law or competition law. And these have specific competences, and if to make these effective, we also need some procedural rules, then we can use Article 114 as a basis for those procedural rules as well. And that makes the picture a bit complicated. Most member states have always been hesitant to harmonization in the European context and in any context because, again, we have those civil procedural rules that have been developed over hundreds of years and that are very much intertwined with our society, legal cultures, and our institutions. So very often negotiations on those procedural instruments are very intense. It is the European Commission that proposes these, and that is very often quite ambitious, but then it's the European Council representing the member states, and also the European Parliament that then enter into negotiations. And sometimes the rules are simply dismissed or have to be changed substantially in order to be acceptable for the member states. In recent years, we've also had other priorities, and of course we first had the financial crisis that hampered the EU and also made it a little bit more tense, the relationship. Then refugee crisis, which is still not over, but yeah, it is a little bit better now, also a big priority. And then, of course, Brexit, which has taken up a lot of the capacity and also some of the goodwill in the European Union. So, for instance, I was involved in a project on the codification of private international law, including international civil procedure. I was initiated by the European Parliament in 2012, but those rules never made it because simply there were other priorities. So that is very important now from an EU perspective. There will be more papers on Brexit and civil procedure than on harmonization of civil procedure if you look at the past few years. Important recent projects that we had is first the European Parliament, who has been very active both in private international law and in civil procedure, and they also took the initiative for a resolution on common minimum standards of civil procedure. Unfortunately, nothing happened with those afterwards. They were adopted in June 2017, but afterwards the European Commission didn't pick it up. So it is a resolution to propose a directive, but nothing happened with those rules. And then there is this model law, the ELI UNIDROIT rules on European civil procedure that are about to be adopted. If we look at the aims, the overriding aims of EU civil justice, and that is always very important to keep in mind also in evaluating the rules, is what the goal is. And the goal is, and always should be, to improve access to justice. Harmonization, just for the sake of harmonization, at least to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. So, always when we look at those rules, they have to be viewed from the perspective of access to justice. And within the broad sense, that is of course not too complicated, not too costly and swift, but also respecting the right to a fair trial. These always have to be balanced. I think the procedural rules that we have are overall fair, though you can have a debate on that. For instance, the European small claims procedure used to be for amounts up to 2,000 euros, but that threshold has been raised to 5,000 euros, and it is quite a light procedure. So some of the member states have the vision, hey, we think this is a too light procedure for quite a considerable amount. But also, of course, the level of income differs per member state. So what in one country maybe 5,000 isn't so much, whereas in other countries that is really a lot. Then speedy and efficient are, of course, always there, but if we look, unfortunately, at how the rules, for instance, the European small claims procedure, are conducted in the member states, then, well, first of all, it's hard to measure, because you cannot say, well, in 2010, it lasted 1 year, and now it is 8 months, because you don't have these measurements, because it's simply not the same procedure. Overall, when we have the evaluation of European procedures, they say that they speed up procedures and thus make it more efficient, but to really measure that is difficult. What we always see is the factual application and implementation in the member state, and to have it embedded into the national system is still very challenging. What I have been involved in a lot is, again, that's why I always mention it as an example, is this European small claims procedure. I found it very interesting from the start because it focuses not on businesses, which are often involved in private international law, because in international cases you usually only litigate for bigger amounts. So businesses are quite central there. The small claims procedure was really aimed at making the life of the citizens better. Also in times when Euroscepticism came up and citizens were questioning what the legitimacy is of the European Union, those procedures online, so that the consumer can fit for a context, it is even more difficult. So we saw that in most, at all, the European Commission made a very big point out of it, and because I was interested in it from a weaker party perspective and trying to make things better, I was always involved in legal trainings for courts, practitioners, and everyone involved, and I gave lectures in Eastern because some if they have a small claim, and some of the rules have been improved. We will see if that is going to work. The classical private international law instruments that we have in Europe, and probably you've heard of the Brussels I regulation, which is a very famous one, and very often used, that is very successful. So if you look at those private international law rules, they work generally well and are used a lot, but the real nitty-gritty civil procedures and uniform procedures don't work very well, or are not very easy, or not very often used. What is also difficult for legal practice, but interesting, of course, as an academic, and gives a ground and legitimacy to make model rules, is that we have a big patchwork. If, as a national legislator, you start to develop the law or you reform your civil procedural rules, you usually or ideally start with an overall vision. What do we want? What do we need? How do the rules work together? But in a legal order, a supranational legal order like the EU, this is not always possible because this competence is limited to certain